Who decides which neighborhoods lose power first? Most people think power outages start with a failure. A storm comes through, a tree falls, a transformer blows. Something breaks, and the lights go out. That explanation feels satisfying because it's simple. It turns loss into accident. It makes the outage feel sudden, external, and unavoidable. But power outages almost never begin with darkness. They begin earlier, in places most people never see, with numbers that look ordinary until they cross a line. They begin when demand starts pressing against capacity, on hot afternoons when air conditioners run continuously, on cold mornings when heaters pull more power than expected, during wildfire season when sections of the grid are already operating under constraint. At first, nothing feels different. Lights still turn on, traffic signals still cycle, refrigerators hum without interruption. From the outside, the system looks stable. Inside, the margin is shrinking. Electric power systems are not built to store large amounts of electricity. They are built to balance it. Every second, generation must match demand almost exactly. Too much or too little can damage equipment, destabilize frequency, or trigger protective shutdowns. So the grid is always watching itself. Operators track how close the system is to the edge, how much reserve capacity remains, how much uncertainty it can still absorb. When those buffers are healthy, the grid can ride out surprises. A generator trips, a line goes down, demand spikes briefly higher than forecast, the system adjusts. But when those buffers thin, priorities shift, not because something has failed, because something might. This is the moment most people never experience directly. There is no alarm, no announcement, no visible signal that the rules are about to change. Electricity still flows, but the grid is no longer asking how to serve everyone equally. It is asking how to stay alive. Once demand approaches the system's limits, electricity stops behaving like a simple service and starts behaving like a scarce resource. Every additional load has to be carried carefully. Every uncertainty becomes a risk that can no longer be ignored. This is when decisions begin to take shape. Not about whether power will be delivered, but about where it can be withheld without breaking the whole. Those decisions are not framed as choices between neighborhoods. They are not discussed in terms of fairness or preference. They emerge from operational logic designed to protect the system from collapse. But the outcome is personal. Some places go dark sooner, some stay dark longer, some lose power repeatedly, while others rarely experience an outage at all. And for the people living there, it does not feel like a system managing risk. It feels like being chosen. This episode is about how those choices actually happen. Not during dramatic blackouts that make headlines, but in the quieter moments before that, when the grid is still working, when electricity is still flowing, when the system is already deciding how much risk it can afford to carry and where that risk will land. To understand why some neighborhoods lose power first, you have to look past the outage itself. You have to look at how the system thinks when it no longer has room to absorb uncertainty. You have to follow the moment when electricity stops being invisible and starts being managed. Part 1. The Illusion of Always On. Electricity feels permanent. You do not plan for it. You do not request it. You do not think about whether it will arrive. It is simply there. You flip a switch and the room responds immediately. Lights come on without hesitation. Appliances wake without complaint. Heating and cooling adjust with the confidence of something that expects compliance. Nothing about that experience suggests fragility. Nothing about it suggests choice. The grid is designed to make electricity feel less like a service and more like a condition of life, like air, like gravity, something present enough to depend on, invisible enough to ignore. That feeling is deliberate. Modern power systems are built to disappear from daily awareness. Generation happens far from population centers. Transmission lines cross landscapes most people never see. Substations sit behind fences, humming quietly. Control rooms operate without windows. The better the system performs, the less attention it draws. And invisibility creates assumptions that electricity is either present or absent. That failure is sudden. That outages happen when something breaks. But the grid does not behave that way. It does not wait for damage before reacting. It does not operate with wide margins. It does not assume conditions will remain stable. It operates close to balance. Electricity cannot be stockpiled in the way people imagine. There is no large reserve waiting to be released when demand rises. Power has to be generated at the same moment it is consumed. Supply and demand must match continuously within narrow tolerances. If generation exceeds demand, frequency rises and equipment overheats. Protective systems intervene. If demand exceeds generation, frequency drops, stability erodes, and automatic shutdowns can cascade. Either direction creates risk. So the grid lives in constant adjustment. Thousands of generators modulate output every second. Load fluctuates as people turn devices on and off. Weather shifts consumption patterns. Industrial demand ramps up and down. Under normal conditions, the system absorbs all of this quietly. You never feel the corrections. You never see the tension. You never notice how close the margins sometimes are. But those margins exist. Operators monitor them continuously. How much power is being generated right now? How much demand is being served? How much reserve capacity remains if something unexpected happens? That last measure matters more than most people realize. Reserve capacity is not comfort. It is tolerance. It determines how much uncertainty the system can survive without losing control. A generator trips offline. A transmission line becomes constrained. A forecast turns out to be wrong. As long as reserves are available, these events remain manageable. The system adjusts. Balance is restored. When reserves thin, the system changes posture. Not fragile yet, but alert. This is the point where electricity starts behaving differently even though nothing changes for the customer. Lights still turn on. Businesses still operate. Homes still feel normal. But inside the system, priorities are narrowing. Because when reserve margins approach critical levels, the grid can no longer afford surprise. Uncertainty itself becomes dangerous. A single failure is no longer just an inconvenience. It becomes something that could push the system beyond safe operating limits. This is where the illusion of always on begins to crack, not because power disappears, but because the system stops assuming it can serve every load without consequence. There is no public signal for this transition, no announcement that conditions have shifted. The change happens gradually, guided by internal thresholds and operator judgment. Demand climbs. Buffers shrink. Tolerance tightens. And with that tightening comes a different way of thinking. Instead of asking how to meet demand, the system begins asking how to protect itself. Instead of asking where electricity should flow, it begins asking where it can be removed without creating greater harm. From the outside, this is hard to reconcile with daily experience. Electricity still feels abundant. Everything still works. From the inside, scarcity is already being managed. This is why outages feel sudden to the people who experience them. The visible moment, when lights go out, is not the start of the decision. It is the final step in a long process of narrowing options. By the time power is cut, the system has already concluded that it cannot carry everything safely. And that conclusion does not happen at the level of households or neighborhoods. It happens at the level of load. Megawatts, circuits, substations, transmission paths. People are not visible to the system directly. Their demand is. When demand becomes something the grid can no longer support equally, electricity stops being invisible. It becomes something that must be actively managed. And that management does not resemble rationing in any familiar sense. There are no cues, no warnings, no equal shares. There are only technical decisions about what can be disconnected quickly, safely, and reversibly. Those decisions, once made, begin shaping who remains in the light and who does not. Part 2. When load becomes liability. As long as the grid has room to absorb uncertainty, electricity behaves like a shared resource. Power flows where it is needed. Demand rises and falls. The system adjusts in the background. But once demand approaches the limits of what the grid can safely carry, electricity stops being neutral. Every additional load becomes something the system has to account for, not as a question of value, as a question of stress. Electric power systems are not built to ask who deserves electricity. They are built to ask where electricity can move safely and where it cannot. That distinction matters. That distinction matters. Because when the system begins protecting itself, it does not look outward at communities. It looks inward at its own structure, at circuits, at substations, at transmission paths. Load is no longer just consumption, it becomes pressure on equipment, on flow paths, on margins that are already narrowing. Pressure has to be managed. The first layer of management is automatic. Protective relays monitor frequency, voltage, and current. When conditions drift outside safe ranges, equipment disconnects to prevent damage. These systems do not understand context. They do not see people, businesses, or neighborhoods. They respond to electrical conditions alone. As demand rises, operators work to keep those protections from triggering unexpectedly. They increase generation where possible. They reroute flows across the network. They shift load away from constrained paths. But these options are finite. Some transmission lines are already operating near thermal limits. Some substations are close to maximum capacity. Some equipment is older and less tolerant of sustained stress. As margins shrink, the system begins sorting load, not through a formal ranking, not through a list labeled important or unimportant, through capability. Some loads are flexible, some are rigid, some can be removed quickly and cleanly, some cannot. This is the moment where electricity becomes a liability. A heavily loaded circuit serving non-critical demand may offer a fast way to reduce stress. A lightly loaded circuit serving essential infrastructure may be functionally untouchable. These distinctions are not improvised in the moment. They are embedded in how the grid is designed. Hospitals, emergency services, water treatment facilities, and major communications infrastructure are placed on circuits engineered to remain energized as long as possible. They are often fed redundantly. They may have dedicated substations or prioritized restoration status. This is not discretionary, it is structural. But protection does not stop with explicitly critical facilities. Commercial districts often sit on more robust infrastructure because economic disruption carries visible, immediate cost. Industrial facilities may receive similar protection because sudden loss of power can damage equipment or interrupt supply chains. Residential areas, especially those without critical loads, are often served by simpler distribution networks with fewer redundancies. This is not a moral hierarchy, it is an engineering outcome. And engineering outcomes accumulate. Once the grid begins operating under constraint, those accumulated choices become visible. Operators are not deciding which neighborhood should lose power. They are deciding which circuits can be disconnected without destabilizing the system. Those circuits tend to be the same ones again and again. This is why outages are patterned rather than random. A neighborhood served by long overhead lines in a heat-stressed region may lose power before a dense area with underground distribution. A rural community at the end of a radial feeder may be disconnected before an urban core with multiple feed paths. From the outside, this feels arbitrary. From inside the system, it feels expected. Once load is treated as liability, the grid values clarity. A circuit that behaves predictably under stress is safer to manage than one that does not. Areas with newer equipment, clearer isolation points, and better telemetry are easier to carry when margins are thin. Areas without those characteristics require more attention, more monitoring, more risk, so the system leans away from them, not deliberately, but consistently. This is how prioritization becomes self-reinforcing. Communities that experience frequent outages often wait longer for upgrades. Slower upgrades increase vulnerability. Increased vulnerability reinforces their role as easy load to shed during future strain. Each step is reasonable on its own. Together, they form a pattern that is difficult to reverse. Load shedding is often described as failure. It is not. It is a safety mechanism designed to prevent uncontrolled collapse. When operators initiate controlled outages, they are choosing a known disruption over an unpredictable one. But known disruption still has consequences. Some customers experience brief interruptions. Others lose power for hours or days. Some experience outages as a recurring condition of life during peak seasons. The system does not register these outcomes as inequities. It registers them as trade-offs, and trade-offs are how complex systems preserve stability. Once the grid begins operating this way, restoration follows the same logic. Crews are dispatched to restore the greatest amount of load as quickly as possible. Large feeders return first. Small, isolated outages wait. This approach is efficient. It is also cumulative. Areas that go dark early often come back late, not because anyone decided they mattered less, because the system is optimized to recover at scale. From the inside, this is success. The grid remains intact. Cascading failure is avoided. Most customers regain power quickly. From the outside, the experience feels different. Electricity no longer feels shared. It feels conditional, dependent on where you live, dependent on how your area is wired, dependent on decisions made long before you ever flipped a switch. This is the point where infrastructure becomes legible, not as something that failed, but as something that sorted. Part 3. The quiet logic of load shedding. By the time power goes out, the most consequential decisions are already behind the scenes. The system has already concluded that it cannot carry everything safely. It has already narrowed its options. It has already determined where stress will be released. What follows is not deliberation. It is execution. Load shedding does not look dramatic from inside the system. There are no alarms sounding across control rooms. No countdowns. No debate. It is procedural. Operators follow predefined plans designed for moments when demand exceeds safe operating limits. Those plans exist because hesitation is dangerous. When the grid is under strain, waiting to decide can be as harmful as choosing incorrectly. So, the system relies on structure. Which circuits are eligible to be disconnected? How much load needs to be removed to stabilize frequency? How quickly that disconnection must occur? These plans are built around equipment behavior, not community boundaries. A circuit that can be isolated cleanly is safer to shed than one that risks destabilizing adjacent infrastructure. A feeder with clear switching points is easier to manage than one that ties together multiple critical loads. Lines that have been disconnected before behave in ways operators understand. Familiarity matters. This is where repetition enters. Circuits that have proven easy to shed become default candidates. Areas that have tolerated outages without cascading problems become known quantities. Over time, the same parts of the system absorb stress again and again, not because they are less valuable, because they are known. Once shedding begins, restoration follows its own internal logic. Crews are dispatched to restore the largest amount of load in the shortest amount of time. Re-energizing a single feeder that brings power back to thousands of customers takes priority over addressing scattered outages that require long travel times and complex repairs. From the system's perspective, this is efficiency. From the customer's perspective, it is waiting. The grid may already be stable again. Frequency may be back within acceptable bounds. Generation may once again exceed demand. But for some communities, power remains out. The system has moved on. The outage has become background. For the people living in those places, time begins to stretch. Food warms in refrigerators. Phones lose charge. Work stops. Medical devices become uncertain. Waiting begins not as a dramatic crisis, but as a series of small degradations. And like waiting in a hospital, waiting without clarity creates its own strain. Utilities publish estimated restoration times, but those estimates are shaped by uncertainty. They shift as conditions change. They move forward. They disappear and return. From inside the system, this is accuracy adjusting to reality. From the outside, it feels like indifference. But indifference is not what is happening. The system is still optimizing, just not around you. Load shedding also creates feedback that is difficult to reverse. Communities that experience frequent outages adapt. They invest in backup power if they can afford it. They change behavior. Businesses hesitate to install sensitive equipment. Residents learn what to unplug first. Those adaptations alter demand patterns. Backup generators reduce load during outages, making those circuits easier to shed in the future. Lower economic activity dampens peak demand, reinforcing the perception that these areas are less critical to protect during strain. From the system's perspective, this looks like success. Stress has been reduced. Risk has been managed. Stability has been preserved. But stability has been achieved by concentrating disruption. This is how inequality enters infrastructure without intent, not through targeting, through response. Another layer of logic appears around prevention. As systems experience repeated strain, operators become more cautious. Thresholds for action lower. Intervention begins earlier. Preventive outages become more common. Power is cut, not because something has failed, but because something might. This is especially visible in regions facing wildfire risk, extreme heat, or aging infrastructure. From the system's perspective, preemptive action is responsible. From the outside, it feels punitive. Power disappears under clear skies. Businesses close preemptively. Daily routines are disrupted not by disaster, but by anticipation. These outages are harder to accept because nothing appears wrong. The sky is clear, the air is still, the lights simply go out. The explanation lives entirely inside the system, and because the system cannot explain itself in human terms, people supply their own explanations. Neglect, favoritism, indifference. Sometimes those interpretations are inaccurate. Sometimes they are not. What remains true is that the grid does not experience these outcomes as choices between people. It experiences them as the least damaging way to survive uncertainty. But survival logic does not distribute harm evenly. It distributes harm where it threatens the system least. Over time, this logic hardens. Circuits become implicitly understood as expendable or protected. Communities learn what to expect. Utilities learn which outages generate pressure and which fade quietly. This is not a conspiracy. It is adaptation. And adaptation is how complex systems avoid collapse. The cost of that adaptation is not eliminated. It is relocated. The grid remains functional. Power flows most of the time. Large-scale blackouts are avoided, but the price is paid in fragments, by neighborhoods that lose power first, by households that wait the longest, by people whose lives are disrupted repeatedly without a single dramatic failure to point to. By the time anyone tries to name the pattern, it already feels normal. Outages are expected. Preparation becomes individual. Resilience is framed as a personal responsibility. Buy a generator. Have a plan. Adapt. The system has quietly decided that some people will carry more of the burden of keeping the whole stable, and it has done so without ever asking their permission. Part 4. Where the cost of waiting actually lands. The effects of losing power rarely arrive all at once. There is no single moment where inconvenience clearly becomes danger, no sharp line where harm announces itself. Instead, the cost of waiting accumulates quietly, shaped by timing, geography, and circumstance. By the time consequences are visible, they often feel detached from the decisions that produce them. The first place the cost lands is time. Not time measured in minutes or hours, but time as the system experiences it. A power outage that begins overnight behaves differently than one that starts at midday. An outage during a weekday carries different consequences than one on a weekend. A loss of power during extreme heat or cold carries different risks than one during mild weather, even if the duration is identical. These differences are not secondary. They are decisive. When outages begin at night, people wake into disruption rather than preparing for it. Refrigeration has already failed. Phones are already drained. Information arrives late, fragmented, or not at all. When outages stretch into business hours, the cost multiplies. Work stops. Income is lost. Small businesses absorb damage they may never fully recover from. The grid does not register any of this. It tracks megawatts, feeder status, and restoration sequences. Human time moves differently. The next place the cost lands is health. Electricity is woven into modern care in ways that remain invisible until it disappears. Refrigerated medications lose stability. Medical devices require charging. Climate control becomes a matter of safety rather than comfort. For people managing chronic illness, outages turn routine care into risk. For older adults, heat and cold become dangerous more quickly. For families caring for someone medically fragile, each additional hour without power increases uncertainty. These outcomes rarely appear in outage statistics. From the system's perspective, power is either restored or not. Harm that unfolds later does not register as part of the outage. It becomes someone else's problem, somewhere else in the system. The cost also lands unevenly across geography. Urban areas tend to recover faster. Crews are nearby. Feeders are dense. Restoring power reconnects large numbers of customers at once. Rural areas wait. Lines run long distances. Access is slower. Repairs restore fewer customers per hour of work. This is operationally efficient. It is also isolating. A rural household may lose power for days while nearby cities are restored within hours. That difference is framed as logistics, not neglect. But logistics shape lived experience. Waiting in isolation feels different than waiting among many. Silence stretches, uncertainty deepens, the sense of being disconnected becomes literal. Over time, people adapt. They store differently. They plan differently. They lower expectations. Outages become part of the background rather than a disruption. The cost also lands economically. People with resources respond by reducing exposure. They buy generators. They install battery systems. They relocate temporarily or permanently. People without resources absorb the disruption. Food spoils. Work is missed. Medical appointments are delayed. Stress accumulates. These differences compound. Communities that experience frequent outages become less attractive to investment. Businesses hesitate to locate there. Property values stagnate or decline. Those signals feed back into infrastructure decisions. Lower demand justifies fewer upgrades. Fewer upgrades increase vulnerability. Increased vulnerability produces more outages. The loop closes without anyone intending it to. The cost also lands on people inside the system. Utility workers and operators know which outages will last longest. They know which communities will wait. They know which calls will escalate and which will fade quietly. They also know the alternative. If the grid fails completely, recovery takes longer. Damage spreads wider. Harm multiplies. So they accept the trade. Like hospital staff managing capacity, they carry the residue of these decisions. Not guilt, but weight. They remember the outages that stretch too long. The weather events that push communities close to the edge. The moments when there was no good answer to give. Over time, this residue shapes behavior. Thresholds for intervention lower. Preventive outages increase. Caution replaces confidence. From the outside, this can look like overreaction. From the inside, it feels like survival. The most difficult cost to see is the one that never produces a clear event. Delayed harm. Food insecurity that worsens quietly after repeated outages. Health conditions that deteriorate over seasons rather than days. Economic instability that accumulates without a single dramatic cause. Because none of this arrives as a crisis, it rarely gets counted. By the time outcomes diverge, the cause is buried beneath layers of reasonable decisions. This is what makes systems like this hard to talk about honestly. From the outside, it can look like nothing went wrong. Power was restored. The grid held. From the inside, everyone knows how close it came, and how much was shifted away to keep it that way. Waiting does not feel dangerous in the moment. It feels patient. It feels responsible. It feels like buying time. But time is not neutral. Every hour without power transfers risk elsewhere. Every delay pushes cost outward. Every decision to protect the system concentrates strain where it is easiest to carry. By the time the lights come back on, the system has already moved forward. The cost remains, and most of it never traces cleanly back to the moment when the decision was made. Part 5. When the system is still working. Most people never experience a grid failure. They experience a grid operating at its limits. Power flows, lights stay on, daily life continues until it doesn't. But by the time the lights go out, the decisive work has already happened. Not decisions about whether electricity matters, not judgments about who deserves it, but calculations about how much uncertainty the system can tolerate without losing control. Once that threshold is crossed, a different set of rules takes hold. Rules that determine where power is protected and where it is exposed. Rules that shape which outages are brief and which ones stretch on. Rules that distribute risk across geography, infrastructure, and time. These rules are not written down in one place. They are embedded in how the grid is built, in how circuits are configured, in how restoration is prioritized, in how past strain reshapes future response. They are not announced. There is no public signal that the system has entered a different mode. Electricity still feels abundant. The illusion of always on remains intact until it doesn't. Understanding this does not excuse harm or make loss feel smaller, but it does make the system visible. It shows that what feels like failure is often adaptation, that what feels like neglect is often prioritization under constraint, that what feels random is usually patterned. The grid does not collapse when demand exceeds capacity. It protects itself, and in doing so, it decides where the cost of protection will land. Those decisions are not made by individuals selecting neighborhoods. They emerge from systems optimized to survive uncertainty with the least immediate damage to themselves. That optimization keeps electricity flowing for most people most of the time. It also ensures that some people will always be closer to the edge, closer to darkness, closer to waiting, closer to absorbing risk on behalf of the whole. This is not unique to electricity. It is how modern systems behave when they reach their limits. They continue to function. They continue to deliver service. They quietly change the rules of who carries the cost. Seeing those rules does not weaken the system. It makes it legible. It allows better questions to be asked. Not only why the lights went out, but why they went out there, why they stayed out longer, and why the same places experienced that disruption again and again. The grid is still working. That is precisely the point. Subscribe for long-form stories about how systems actually behave when they operate under pressure. Each episode follows a line most people never see, where ordinary decisions quietly shape who carries the risk of keeping the world running.